Over to Karen.
Thank you, everybody, for having me today. I'm really happy to be here. Sorry for technology. I always joke around sometimes with my fellow colleagues. Therapists need therapy because of technology issues. But I wanted to hopefully make this a very conversational process, but obviously I can't hear you guys. So if you wanted to type your questions, you can do that. Or if there's anything at the end of the presentation that you have, you can always email me. I will send you all kinds of contact information and resources at the end of today's session. The focus today is to go through some different goals of the session. And so the goals for today are understanding mental health and mental illness, understanding the impacts of mental health and mental illness among entrepreneurs, understanding Eustress. Some of you may have heard of this term before, but it is something that has been relatively new in terms of the discussion around Eustress, and then stress and distress. And I'm going to differentiate between those. Understanding stress overload and burnout, things that we can do about stress and healthy coping strategies, self-compassion, and then again, awareness of resources that are available to you and then in the community. So through NATE and in the community. So I'm going to go into understanding mental health and mental illness. I think these terms are often used interchangeably, but I think, again, we have to differentiate between the two. So mental health refers to our emotional, psychological, our social well-being, how we feel about ourselves and interact with others. And mental health is not the same as mental illness, although poor mental health can lead to mental and physical illnesses. I think one way that we can differentiate is that we all have mental health, but we might not all have mental illness. So that's the kind of big difference. And I'll go into a little bit more detail around that. When we have good mental health, we are resilient, can handle life's challenges and stresses, and have meaningful relationships and make sound decisions. As you can see, I'm kind of looking over to my other screen here. So I did somehow manage to get the PowerPoint on a separate screen, which is good. But just in case you're wondering why I'm not looking directly into the screen. So again, mental illness refers, so the difference again, mental health is something we all have and we all have it at all times, but we might not all have mental illness. So mental illness refers to the wide range of disorders that affect mood, thinking, and behavior. Some of the major types of mental illnesses include depression, anxiety, mood disorders, including bipolar, personality disorders, trauma, PTSD, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors. They can affect anyone regardless of age, gender, social standing, religion, or race and ethnicity. We may experience distress and problems functioning at work, home, or social situations, and is not something a person can overcome with willpower. And there's lots of different factors that can contribute to mental health and mental illness, but specifically mental illness would be things such as genetics, brain chemistry, trauma, abuse, family history of mental illnesses. So understanding, again, mental health and mental illness, 1 in 5 Canadians meets the criteria for having a mental illness in their lifetime. So that's 24.1% of women and 17% of men. So this average of 20% affects every one of us, whether at work, at home, or personally. So again, although the terms are often used interchangeably, mental health and mental illness is not the same thing, but they are not mutually exclusive. And so the fundamental difference is that, again, everyone has some level of mental health all of the time, just like physical health. And I think the importance of this conversation today is being able to normalize that conversation and recognize we can easily go into a doctor's office and talk about our physical health and finding different strategies to cope with our physical health and well-being, but we don't all do the same for our mental well-being because there's still lots of stigma out there. Much as it's becoming much more of a kind of normalized discussion in our society and around NATE, you can see lots of different events happening. But there's still lots of stigma out there. So again, kind of thinking about, despite poor mental health not defined as an illness, having poor mental health is often associated with emotional distress, psychosocial impairment, comparable to that of a major depressive episode. So again, it can really look like a major depressive episode. Oh, presentation. Sorry. Cut. um, just going back, sorry. Oops. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. So again, 1 in 5 Canadians meets that criteria for having the mental illness. And like I mentioned, these terms are not mutually exclusive, but I'm going to show you a diagram on the next page here. And so this kind of shows a bit of a continuum. So on the top here, you can see there's the optimal mental health. So we can have optimum mental health without a mental illness. We can go down in the other quadrant and see that we can actually have poor mental health without a mental illness. We can have poor mental health with mental illness, but we can also have optimal mental health with a mental illness. So again, it doesn't mean that they are two separate things and kind of on two different continua, but they are intertwined very closely. So again, if we have that poor mental health over a long period of time, that could look like a major depressive episode. But again, it's not just about sheer willpower to overcome these things either, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we move into understanding stress. I'll maybe ask questions at the end, or people can ask questions at the end or type them into me. So mental health and entrepreneurs. Society often idolizes successful entrepreneurs and celebrates fast growth companies. Fortune 500 CEOs and self-made millionaires and billionaires seem to set the standard for what an entrepreneur should be like. The reality is that before making it big, many of these entrepreneurs have struggled through times of debilitating anxiety and despair, times when they maybe feel everything is crashing down on them. And entrepreneurs experience intense stress and anxiety while trying to sustain their business. There were a couple of studies that I took a look at in terms of the research in Canada and the US around mental health and entrepreneurs. So the Canadian Mental Health Association in June 2019, they did a report titled Going It Alone. So this reviewed the mental health and well-being of Canada's entrepreneurs. And there was a nationwide survey done of 478 entrepreneurs across Canada, along with 20 one-to-one interviews with entrepreneurs in Canada. And so some of the results of that were kind of a bit of a mixed bag, but some were saying, overall they had pretty okay mental health, but I think one of the things that came up was, again, not being comfortable talking about it. So lots of stigma, didn't feel comfortable going to, for example, a supervisor of a company. They did talk about how they struggled at times with that work-life balance, and there was some difficulty with like sleepless nights and long hours. And so again, as much as they maybe had an idea that their mental health was okay, I have a thought that probably they were thinking about mental illness, not mental health, because then you actually look at the results of the report, they suggest that most of them probably struggled in that mental health category. Really differentiate between the two. So with that mental health piece, again, a lot of us can struggle with poor mental health without a mental illness. They often talked about how they had to be on all of the time. So that idea of being kind of at the top of their game all of the time. So that pressure to be the best often contributed to some of the struggles. And so that was one of the overall outcomes of this report. And I put the link at the bottom in my references and resources that if people can have access to that. It's about a 40-page report. And then there was another study done in March 2019 at the University of San Francisco. Michael A. Freeman seems to be a pretty well-known researcher in the area. He focused on the mental health crisis that is raging among men and women who comprise the entrepreneurial community. And I don't have like all of the stats in front of me, but again, the thought was that they were experiencing rates of suicide, bipolar disorder, ADHD, depression, and anxiety at higher, almost at about 80 to 90% higher rate than the average. Again, some of those same reasons found in the Canadian study was what they were researching at that time. So I'll just go on to understanding. Will be the next slide. And so for the remainder of this discussion, I'll be looking at the understanding of stress. I had a couple of questions, but we can always maybe have, we can take those questions or you can message me if you have some specific questions. I am available till, I believe, 2 o'clock today. So if there's anything that comes up about some of the information, you're welcome to message me. So my questions were, when you hear the word stress, what comes up for you? And what are your beliefs about stress? And how does that impact our response? The reason why I ask this question is I think as a society, stress is sort of that really kind of bad, there's often a kind of gets a bad rap, so to speak. So we often hear things like, for example, I'm so stressed out all the time. And if I'm not necessarily stressed, I'm not productive. And so I have to be stressed. And so I often hear that from students coming into my office, for example, that when they're like, if I'm not stressed, then I'm not doing something and I'm not productive. So often stress will be something that's negative, and there's this kind of mentality, if we're not stressed to the max and we're not feeling that burnout, then we're not being productive or reaching those goals. So then our societal beliefs about stress can really impact kind of how we respond to stress. So historically, our response to stress is that fight or flight. So that fight is, we stand our ground, defend our position, attack, dig in, and persevere. Or flight, we give way, we retreat, we discard and remove ourselves, or we give up, or we move on. So my hope today with our conversation around understanding stress is that stress is more psychological. So it's not that fight or flight response anymore, but our brain doesn't differentiate between that physical and mental stress. So chemicals such as cortisol can build up in our brain. And the role of cortisol is to turn off the high centers of your brain so you don't waste a lot of brain power. But I think the hope today is to raise some more awareness around the difference between eustress, which is actually good stress, versus distress. So there are 2 different types of stress. So the eustress is, again, good stress in opposition with the bad stress. So by making that distinction between the good stress and the eustress, distress, Selle, he was one of the kind of philosophers around this. He wanted to show that stress, while being a reaction to a stressor, not always be linked to negative scenarios. Since the stressor is often only a perceived stressor rather than a real one, again, changing the way the person relates to the stressor can influence the intensity of the experience. So again, a bit of a diagram. We have that positive stress in the middle. So that's when we are really focused. We have focused attention, we have emotional balance, we have rational thinking. When we start to go into that distress, that starts to impair our attention. We maybe feel bored, we may feel confused. So we may have apathy. So that's when we maybe have too little of that kind of stress piece. And then too much is the distress. So we then feel that we might feel some excitement, but we might also experience disorganization and burnout. Again, I think the major point that I want to express is that we have this psychological and physiological response, that's fight or flight. We have that increase in the cortisol when we are maybe experiencing some overwhelming feelings about our workloads or what's kind of on our plate, everything that we have to do. But we can also change that by re-examining those stressors and saying, how do I maybe focus my attention a little bit differently? What do I need to manage? How do I manage my time? And I'll go into some different coping strategies around that as well. So again, Eustress can be that more positive approach. And another way of looking at it is almost that crisis versus opportunity. So there's the crisis, but there's also the opportunity of finding ways of coping with the different stressors that we all face. Some examples of Eustress could be things, again, like our schedules and being busy and meeting our goals with school or work, as much as sometimes, yes, when we experience it for a prolonged period of time, it can feel a bit more like that burnout. But I think if we are reframing things and approaching it in a way of, this is kind of exciting and I have that adrenaline and I'm working on things, it won't feel maybe as stressful when we start things. Other types of Eustress might be trying new things, like it pushes us outside that comfort zone a little bit, but it also can help us with trying new things. And when we start to feel those kind of how our body can help mobilize us, and if we have those butterflies in our stomach about trying something new or even presenting, thinking about that today, it's also, again, a good stress to be able to do this work or to try again something new. For example, people always talk about Eustress and trying like mountain climbing or singing karaoke if they haven't ever sung it before. There's lots of different things that Eustress, different examples of Eustress. When we start to think about the negative impacts of the distress or the stress overload, again, we can have things like impaired cognitive performance. We might not be able to focus or concentrate. We could have brain fog, might feel dizzy or lightheaded. So again, these are those physical and more cognitive warning signs. Can't sleep, constant worry, blanking out, feeling burnt out, panic attacks, and lowered immunity. So obviously having that stress overload or distress can really impact our mental health. And again, these are all kind of very specific physical warning signs of depression and anxiety as well. So when, for example, if someone's coming into counseling and kind of talking about some of these things, often when we're doing our assessments for things like depression and anxiety, these are some of the main factors that we would take a look at, especially sleep. Sleep is really crucial. crucial to our, again, well-being, our concentration, our focus, and it can impact so much. I'll go into a little bit more about sleep in one of my other slides, but again, sleep is one of those first warning signs that we will ask about on any type of kind of assessment that we're doing for someone's mental health and well-being. So again, things that we can do about stress or distress. So some different ideas around stress prevention and stress reduction, different relaxation techniques. I will go through some of that information now. So number one, being prepared. Sometimes with students, we often will ask, are things like, are school supplies organized, or is our study area set up? Did we do some food planning or meal planning or other purchases made that we might make? So for example, if we're starting school or starting a new job, there are lots of things that we can do to be prepared to make our life a little bit easier. Because again, I often hear from students or people starting out in the field, they'll share with me, I'm so stressed out in the mornings. I'm running around trying to grab all of my stuff, and I can always kind of there just at the nick of time, or sometimes I'm late. And so they're often, it's because they're maybe making a lunch in the morning, or they maybe don't know where all their supplies are. So even doing some of those things to pre-plan and prepare ahead of time can make the world of difference. Kind of again, thinking about outside commitments, are they realistic? If we're doing some volunteering, our social aspect of our life, we have backup plans if something goes wrong with our car or childcare, are we feeling ill? So again, lowering our stress by organizing and preparing ahead can be really helpful. And I do have a bit of a note to not go overboard. I think there's a limit of how much planning we can do. We don't want to plan every single aspect of our day. I think there needs to be some flexibility around that. And I think that can be really important to remember, because there will be things that come up that will create those bumps in the road, or whether it's traffic or weather, or maybe again technology fails. There will be things that will come up that we just have to be a bit more flexible about. So we don't want to go overboard with our preparation. Time management. This is often another kind of major area that students will come to either ourselves or learning services. And again, I'll give that information at the end of the presentation as an area of stress. So again, it's one of the most important stress prevention tools. We often, as much as we need a break from routine, we really need one. As we probably all found out during this time, during COVID-19, we've been thrown out of our normal day-to-day routines, whether we like it or not. But we often will, that's our baseline. So we do try to establish something. So again, trying to go back to that routine, again, not too rigid, but something that works for you. So making sometimes those daily to-do lists, prioritizing, and working on priorities first. I think another area of that time management piece of prioritization, I often hear from people that say, everything's feeling super urgent and important. And when we actually go through kind of asking, what's important, and we make the list, and usually there's lots on that list. And then we ask what's urgent, we start to recognize that not everything is urgent. So sometimes that can help us streamline our priorities, and there could only be maybe 3 or 4 things on that list that are feeling a bit more urgent, and that's what we start to work on. Keeping track of how we are spending our time. I think we spend so much time on our devices, our computers, cell phone, games, watching TV, that we don't realize maybe how much time we're doing that, because it's such a part of our lives today. So just sometimes that's that mindfulness and being aware of how much time we are spending. we could probably, if we start to keep track of that a little bit more, we could probably also find more time for other things, for self-care, but also maybe for our work. Self-care. And sleep is the #1 self-care tip. If you do any type of research on things like depression and anxiety, any type of self-care or well-being tool, they're going to suggest sleep as the #1 self-care tip. Ultimate amount for most college-age students would be 8 to 9 hours. And then signs that you may be sleep deprived would be things like your alarm clock wakes you up. You have trouble, usually again, if we're feeling more rested, we probably are waking up before our alarm clock. I've had students share with me they need 5 or 6 alarms just to get them up. I'm like, that's probably a really good indicator that there could be some sleep deprivation going on or not having that REM sleep that we need. Again, if we notice that we're nodding off during the day, or if we're falling asleep, it says it's good that we fall asleep quickly, but if we're kind of falling asleep so fast that it's probably a good sign that maybe we're not getting enough sleep and that we're pretty exhausted. Need coffee? I 100% need coffee. I'm sure lots of us do, but if we feel like we're needing coffee or energy drinks to keep us alert, that can be a bit of a struggle as well. Also an indicator. I think, again, for the most part, people can probably function for a little while on that 5 to 6 hours. Each person is a little bit different, but at the same time, we need a certain number of periods of an hour and a half sleep cycles to actually go into that REM sleep, which is the most restorative sleep.
You cannot hear Ryan because Karen is not talking.
Okay, that is a great question. Can you hear me? Thanks, Monica. That's a great question. I think the earlier we start speaking about mental health, the better. I think if we are talking about mental health from a very young age and what can impact our mental health, what we can do to take care of our mental health, I think the better. I don't think any time is too soon. Obviously, it would need to be age appropriate. For example, if we're working with younger students, finding different ideas to talk about things like healthy relationships and different things about impulse control and managing our emotions and mindfulness and feeling calm and self-soothing strategies. I think the earlier we talk about mental health, the better. So I know they do have similar courses of, like, for example, mental health first aid that we offer here at NAIT. I'm not sure what that's looking like right now, but they have had mental health first aid for students and staff here at NAIT. They do have something comparable for high school, and I know they have lots of programs in high schools talking about healthy relationships. And again, different strategies for self-care, self-soothing, and kind of think ways to kind of understand our emotions and also express our emotions. That answers the question. So some tips for improving sleep, again, regular sleep and waking hours, trying to keep the routine around that, and a regular routine for eating also helps. Again, I don't know the exact number of hours, but I think there is about 3 or 4 hours from the time we finish eating we go through that digestion process, and then if we, for example, we probably all recognize if we've eaten something too late, and it probably impacts our sleep. It's more difficult to fall asleep when we have, again, a full stomach. So again, regular sleep and regular eating habits, a relaxing routine before bed. They do talk about at least one, ideally 2 hours before bed, we are starting to shut down our electronic devices. I'm guilty of not doing that, that's for sure. But at the same time, I notice a pretty big difference when I do. I think when we start to kind of unwind at the end of the evening, especially from our devices, because that blue light can really impact, again, our brain and brain activity. It can be really helpful if we start to shut down a couple of hours before bed. Having a consistent sleep environment free of distractions, anything like reading, something light. Not probably, well, or actually, I remember I always used to fall asleep reading textbooks. So if you wanted to read a textbook, sometimes that can help people fall asleep. But there might be something light that you could read, or maybe certain music that is self-soothing, maybe bath, meditation, and journaling can be really helpful. One of the things that I do hear a lot, again, from students is I have a hard time shutting down my mind at night. I'm thinking about everything that I did that day, or I maybe have anxiety about, or feel uncertain about, or I'm thinking about everything that's coming up the next. And sometimes people have a really difficult time shutting down their mind at night. So something like journaling, kind of just to process our day, or something called, that's kind of a head to toe relaxation that can be really helpful, where we can really start to, again, work on that bedtime routine. Regular exercise really helps with sleep, but not right before bed. So again, we don't want to be kind of going to the gym and lifting weights at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. But again, regular exercise does really help with feeling more tired at the end of the day. Again, sleep, having a balanced diet, talking with friends or someone you can trust about any worries or problems, limiting our intake of caffeine and alcohol. I think, again, it doesn't mean that we want to just change every habit. It's just trying to become more mindful. For example, if we're start drinking coffee until early into the evening, most likely that's going to impact us. I've met with many people where they probably have something called caffeine-induced anxiety, where they feel extremely jittery after any amount of caffeine. So just trying to be aware of that and how things like that can impact our body. Doing something for ourselves every day, something that's not work related or school related, and that can be, again, anything for each person individually. Planning a fun activity at least once a week. Having something to look forward to can really help with burnout. If we have something at the end of each week that we actually look forward to, that can really shift our focus to not all of the stress and the impact of work and everything that we've had to do, but if we have this relief at the end of the week that we see coming up, that can really, again, reduce burnout. And again, overall, taking care of our mental health and asking for help if you are struggling. That piece around asking for help if we are struggling. go into that in a moment. I think that's, again, part of that stigma piece. So lots of people will tell me that it was really hard for them to ask for help, or they didn't maybe know exactly where to go for help, or they kind of felt maybe they were wanting to help themselves and do it themselves. And so that mentality of that we have to do it alone is often still there, but I think it can be such a relief to be able to share with somebody. And I'll go into this a little bit more just at the end of the presentation when we talk about how to support others as well. When we share with somebody, it can be such a relief, and people often feel that weight lifted off their shoulders when they can actually talk about things out loud instead of everything just being in our own minds. Can really help with, again, reducing the stigma, but also taking care of our mental health. Again, exercise is another great way, ideally 5 times per week for 30 to 60 minutes, but anything that we can do helps in this area. It doesn't have to be strenuous. It can be anything that you feel is helpful for you. I know once things start to go back to a little bit more of the norm that we're used to, there is a anxiety reduction kind of pilot project that Nate Student Counseling and Nate Fitness came together and did sort of like an anxiety reduction 4 to 6 week pilot project where we did kind of an assessment of where the person's anxiety was at. And after their time with Nate Fitness kind of came back to us and we assessed again, and they had an opportunity to have some personal one-to-one training, and it was in a group setting, which again can be a little bit scary for some people exercising with others, but it's also that social aspect that can be really powerful. So this was this is one opportunity that students can have access to, again, once things are a little bit back to the norm. And I can also send some information along about that. I just have a note here how overdoing exercise can contribute to stress. For example, lots of people then, we sometimes shift from one thing to another that we feel stressed about. So the reason why how overdoing exercise can contribute to stress is when we become very rigid. I just wanted to point that out as again, another something to be aware of. For example, if we are overdoing it and really strict with diet and exercise, that can create some different issues that can come up. So much as it's a stress relief, we just want to be aware that it can also contribute to stress at times. And things like exam anxiety are also things that come up for students and anybody in any of the programs at NATE. Be really helpful even before exams, for example, to take a 5 to 10 minute brisk walk, or before interviews or presentations. Another kind of area of a strategy for working through our mental health and well-being and things like depression and anxiety and different stressors is being self-aware. So again, knowing our reactions to stress as well. And I think the more we become self-aware, the more we can do about it. So what causes me to be stressed? What are the signs? Where do I feel it in my body? Lots of people feel it in their shoulders or their neck or their stomach. Again, could be a heaviness in our chest. And so the more, again, we are aware of that distress in our body, the more we can start to implement different strategies to shift. One really simple one might be something like asking ourselves, you know, if we notice that warning sign and we start to notice that kind of negative self-talk coming up, that we're maybe overthinking things, even asking ourselves something as simple as, is this thought helpful to me right now? Because a lot of our thoughts are often the you shoulds, or I have to, or why didn't you? And it can be very negative. And so asking ourselves, you know, are these thoughts helping me right now? Most likely they're not. Because they can often contribute to, again, more of those physical symptoms and distress. Checking into yourself and seeing how charged we are feeling. So again, is our battery charged? And if it is feeling depleted, then what can we do to recharge? Being realistic. This is a really big one, I think, for all of us. Again, perfectionism is often a huge contributor to stress and distress. So setting realistic goals for ourselves, striving for the best you can realistically do, and setting boundaries on assignments and studying, taking breaks, and learning to accept what we cannot change. So lots of students will share with me, I have to just go and study all day, every hour of the day. But after a while, we often will start to notice, okay, I've read the same line like 10 times. Things are not sinking in anymore. So if we can take those natural breaks, they actually say 50 minutes is a good time to kind of work on something, take a 10-minute break, and then come back. What we need to be careful with is that 10-minute break can sometimes turn into like 3 hours. So if we have that set goal for the day and we're doing a 3 or 4 hour period, taking those natural 10-minute breaks where we get up and go for a walk, have something to eat, have a drink of water, and then coming back to it can just naturally clear our minds to kind of get back to the task at hand. Having a positive attitude. And I don't mean to make light of this or say this is as easy as it is said here, but I think again, having a positive attitude can really help. Doesn't mean that we have to be happy all the time, because I think there is sort of this idea in society, just be happy all the time. I don't think that's realistic, because I think it's okay to not be okay. And I think it's okay to talk about that. I think it's really important to talk about that. And that's what can help with reducing that stigma, because I think that happiness, that idea of happiness, that we have to be happy all the time, can contribute, unfortunately, negatively to that stigma around mental health and well-being. It kind of suggests that we just have to be happy and get over it. And that's not realistic either. So, but having said that, having kind of that positive attitude, that positive outlook on ourselves, understanding things like self-compassion, which I'll talk a little bit about before ending the presentation, it can be helpful, but it can also make it a little bit easier to say, okay, I am having challenges and struggles, and now what do I need to kind of work through them? That's what I mean by positive attitude. I think the flip side of that would be if we had a negative attitude, we would be saying really terrible things to ourselves and being very judgmental and critical. But it's not to say that we don't make mistakes or have challenges or struggles. It's reframing that to say, how can I learn from this, and what do I need to do differently? So things like reinforcing positive self-statements, focusing on our good qualities and accomplishments, our strengths, what's working for us, avoiding comparison and competition. That's a tough one, because I know there is a lot of competition out there in our society, in our world, and often maybe amongst entrepreneurs as well, where we're kind of in that place of, we want to be at our optimal and our best, and it's hard to not compare. But at the same time, that comparison can also really contribute to some social anxiety. That's another kind of main area that comes up for students, is as much as, yes, there's that competition and that healthy competition where we're kind of challenging one another, can also really contribute to a lot of social anxiety. And then another part of positive attitude is making sure we have that balance in our life. So things like, again, learning from our past. So evaluating on a daily and weekly basis. What did I do well? What could I improve on? How effectively am I managing my time? What are maybe some of my major distractors, and what helped keep me focused? So it's not saying that everything went great, but it's also not saying that everything went wrong. So it's finding that middle ground of how we learn from our past and reframe things as part of that positive outlook. And then again, some things like relaxation techniques can be really helpful for working through distress and part of our good mental health. But there are different things that work for different people. It could be things like walking, or it could be talking, it could be organizing, it could be writing, physical exertion. But a couple of relaxation techniques that can be helpful are things like slow abdominal breathing. And I often talk about diaphragmatic breathing. Often when we're breathing, we're just breathing from our chest and we're not getting right down to the diaphragm. And so when we breathe from just our chest, it often maybe feels more distressing for us. But when we breathe from our diaphragm, we're really getting all of that air in and also exhaling all of that air. So it helps to really slow things down and any symptoms around anxiety or panic that might be coming up. I mentioned the progressive muscle relaxation, the PMR, head to toe relaxation. So basically that's kind of going, you can put on relaxing music, you can have essential oils, it can be a whole thing that you do for yourself. It's great where you actually go and you flex your toes and then you release and you do this kind of all the way up your body. And it kind of allows us to recognize the difference between how the tension in our body, but also the relaxation in it. Visualizing, so a calm place is a great thing to do where we can really start to focus on, something real or imagined, and going through going through our senses. So 5 things I can see, 5 things I can hear, 5 things I can smell, 5 things I can touch. And it can really provide a visual sense of calm in our mind. And this is something we can take with us wherever we go. So calm place is a really great one. I had mentioned the thought stopping and replacement. So this is when we ask ourselves something like, is this thought really helpful for me? Just kind of puts that stop sign up and allows us to kind of reframe and maybe shift to a more positive message. And lastly, humor. Humor is so important for our well-being. I do like to differentiate between kind of that wholesome humor, though, and hostile humor. So wholesome humor is that kind of levity, something we can kind of laugh at ourselves. We're not laughing at others. We're laughing maybe just about the funniness of a situation. But when it's more hostile humor, that's when things like maybe we notice sarcasm or ridicule. Often there's lots of, for example, comedians often use hostile humor. And as much as, yes, we've all laughed at it, it can be very damaging. So I think if we just ask ourselves, if I'm having to maybe apologize for something with the humor I'm using, or if I'm, putting myself down and feel worse at the end of that, that's when we maybe have to shift to more wholesome humor. I think this is kind of getting to the end of my presentation. I know we're close to the end of time here, but one of the areas that I talk a lot about in counseling is practicing self-compassion. I've added this as a resource at the end as well. Dr. Christine Neff is a great researcher in the area of self-compassion, and she talks about 3 main elements. So self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and mindfulness versus over-identification. So that self-kindness would be, we ask ourselves, what would I say to somebody else? We're often much more compassionate to others than we are to ourselves. So this just allows us, again, to shift to having the same compassion that we might have for others for ourselves. That common humanity versus isolation. So it's recognizing that we all experience suffering and struggles and we're not alone. But often we might feel we are alone. So again, practicing self-compassion, we recognize, hey, lots of people are probably struggling with things like finding balance and stress and distress and time management. So not alone in that. And then mindfulness versus over-identification. So mindfulness, again, allows us to be more aware in the moment without kind of assigning any type of a value to a situation. So For example, you're writing a test and you are noticing a noise out in the hallway. So mindfulness would say something like, okay, notice the noise and then come back to our breath or come back to the task at hand. Over identification might be, oh gosh, I'm noticing that now I'm distracted. Now I'm going to lose focus for this test. And we start to go on with our thoughts. So again, mindfulness is recognizing the noise or the distraction, but then coming back to the moment versus over identifying with what's going on. It's a simple example of mindfulness, but there are lots out there. Some other ideas of things to do, again, getting involved. A little bit difficult now during this time, obviously, but there's things around NATE's activities, intramurals, clubs, outings, orientation activities, program activities that are happening, and taking advantage of the resources. So I will send this link, all this information to you, Cecile. But I have our counseling at nate.ca, and either you can email us if you ever have anything that's coming up for you, or you can fill out the link here. It will take you right to our web form, and that will come directly to the counseling at nate.ca inbox. Learning services is another valuable resource. So they do lots of work around workshops, supplemental learning, learning strategies, learning advisors, and I've included their link as well. Obviously, there's the International Student Center, and we have a counselor embedded in there. Lisa Kamatatan, which is the Aboriginal Center, they have wonderful activities going on there, great resources as well for more of that cultural piece, and they have a room where you can kind of do meditation, and they have lots of great, again, guest speakers that come in and elders that come in. Athletic services, like I mentioned, Student Service Center, NATESA, and then the last one I wanted to put here was mywellness.ca. That's an online resource that you can go in and you can fill out all kinds of information, and they will give you some feedback about maybe what's happening for you. I do hear from people it's a little bit overwhelming because often they will come back with a whole list of issues of potential diagnoses, and they used to actually put lists of medications and things like that on there, and it was a lot to kind of work through, but now they're kind of going through and making some suggestions about what might be going on, but also some recommendations about next steps. Mywellness.ca is another great online resource. Just a kind of final note about helping others, because we've learned a lot about helping, different things that we can do to help ourselves, but there are things that we can do to help others as well. So one of the things I always like to keep in mind when we're talking with others, whether it's our fellow students and classmates or coworkers, family, friends, here is just that acronym: empathy, active listening, and respect. It's just something simple to keep in mind when we are thinking about helping others. But when someone is approaching you, most likely there's a reason why they're approaching you. They've kind of maybe recognized that you are a good listener already, or that they trust you, or that they feel comfortable talking to you about what's going on for them. So just, again, keeping that in mind. And remembering that we don't always have to fix and rescue, but simply asking if someone needs help and listening to what is going on is very powerful. We don't always have to have the best advice or solution, just reminding ourselves that we can listen, and that is very powerful. And validation, so that validation of I hear you, I can understand how you might be feeling that way, can again go a long way. We don't always have to have the best response or think we have to find all the world's solutions to each situation. But just remembering some of these simple communication tools and different strategies can be really helpful with others. And I always say sharing information. Sharing information and resources about from today, for example, or something you might see around NATE as a different club or a different seminar or webinar that's going on. Just sharing information can be helpful. It can also help open up conversation. And just in closing, one thing that we can do for yourself to take care of your mental health, and one thing you can do to help reduce the stigma around mental health for entrepreneurs. It's just something, obviously we can't have a conversation about that right now, but something to keep in mind as we close up the presentation for today would be, what's one thing that you can do for yourself to take care of your mental health? And one thing you can do to help reduce the stigma around mental health for entrepreneurs. And people can write in their responses if they like, or if there's any other questions that are coming up.
I think that we're going to end it there. Thanks everybody who could stay a little bit longer just to finish the presentation. I'm sorry we had issues at the beginning. I will be sending out the slides if you want them. You've got my email address from the invitation, so send me an email if you would like the slides, and I will send them out to you. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for joining us.